How does a rising star become a headline? And how does a headline threaten to erase the star? Few names in recent Hollywood carry that tension more tightly than Ezra Miller's. Within a decade, they moved from the promise of festival acclaim to the glare of franchise fame, and then into a storm of incidents that turned every appearance into a Rorschach test. Was this the making of a daring, complicated artist, or the unmaking of a career on fast forward? The public saw fragments, viral clips, police reports, studio statements, and a film marketed under the shadow of its lead actor. But fragments are not a story. A story needs a spine: what set the ascent in motion, what accelerated the fall, and what, if anything, remains when the noise dies down. To answer that, we have to strip away speculation and focus on the record. The discipline that built a breakout reputation, the creative choices that positioned a young performer at the center of a billion-dollar machine, and the cascading events that forced audiences, executives, and Miller themselves to confront consequences in real time. This is not about sensationalism. It's about cause and effect. What industry pressures shaped the person behind the cape? Which decisions were theirs? And which belonged to a system that prizes profit over people? Why did some doors slam while others surprisingly stayed open? The truth isn't tidy, but it is traceable, and it often hides in the unexamined moments between a red carpet flash and a courtroom calendar. Before we dive in, subscribe to Hollywood Exposed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the full arc of this story and the ones to come. Then, let's do what the headlines rarely do. Follow the thread from the beginning, step by step, without flinching. To understand who Ezra Miller is and why their name still ignites debate, we need to go back to where the rise began. Ezra Miller entered Hollywood not through the front gates of a blockbuster studio, but through the narrow corridors of independent film. Born in 1992 New Jersey, they trained as an opera singer in childhood before shifting to acting, carrying with them an intensity that few young performers possess. That intensity quickly caught the eye of filmmakers who sought someone capable of channeling raw vulnerability and menace on screen. By the time We Need to Talk About Kevin premiered in 2011, Miller had become impossible to ignore. Their portrayal of a troubled teenager responsible for a school tragedy was chilling, uncompromising, and unforgettable. Critics described the performance as a revelation. Here was an actor who could embody darkness without caricature, who could demand empathy even in the shadow of horror. That role was not just a breakout, it was a signal that Ezra Miller was an artist unafraid of risk. Soon after came The Perks of Being a Wallflower, 2012, a very different showcase. As Patrick, the charismatic and wounded friend who helped guide outsiders through the chaos of adolescence, Miller radiated warmth and defiance. This performance resonated with an entire generation of viewers who saw in Patrick a reflection of their own struggles with identity, belonging, and courage. Two films, side by side, displayed a rare duality: menace on one screen, tenderness on the next. Hollywood, always hungry for versatility, took notice. What followed was both inevitable and precarious, the leap from art house acclaim to franchise spectacle. When Warner Brothers announced Miller as Barry Allen the Flash within the DC Extended Universe, it was confirmation that the industry viewed them as more than a festival darling. They were now a face of global entertainment, carrying the weight of comic book fandom and corporate expectation. Yet this rapid ascent contained its own seeds of risk. The intensity that made Miller magnetic on-screen also made them unpredictable off it. The transition from indie credibility to franchise responsibility is rarely smooth, and for Ezra Miller, the friction was about to define the next decade. But before the storm, there was the climb, the transformation from an unknown teenager into one of the most talked about young actors of their generation. Ezra Miller's rise in Hollywood was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices that positioned them as one of the most distinctive voices of their generation. Unlike many young actors who pursued safe, conventional roles, Miller gravitated toward material that was difficult, uncomfortable, and often controversial. This instinct for risk-taking defined their early trajectory and built a reputation that Hollywood couldn't easily ignore. Their first steps were modest appearances in television and small films like After School, 2008, where Miller played a boarding school student who accidentally films two classmates overdosing. The performance was unnerving, tapping into themes of isolation and voyeurism that foreshadowed the darker roles to come. The film didn't reach mainstream audiences, But it reached the critics, who began to notice Miller's ability to embody unease without overplaying it. The real breakthrough arrived with We Need to Talk About Kevin, 2011. Acting alongside Tilda Swinton and John C. Reilly, Miller brought to life a character so chillingly detached yet human that the film became a cultural talking point. Critics singled out Miller's work as the core of the movie's impact. It wasn't just that they played a troubled teenager. It was that they seemed to understand, on a cellular level, how to communicate menace through silence, through a glance, through the weight of unspoken words. For a 20-year-old, it was an extraordinary feat. From there, the pivot to The Perks of Being a Wallflower, 2012, revealed the other side of Miller's talent. As Patrick, they embodied joy, heartbreak, humor, and resilience all in a single role. Audiences, particularly young viewers, saw Patrick as a symbol of authenticity. The character's openness about sexuality and vulnerability resonated deeply, at a time when Hollywood still hesitated to give queer characters complexity. Miller, already openly queer in their own life, infused Patrick with lived truth that turned a supporting role into a cultural icon. Two performances Kevin and Patrick bookended a revelation. Ezra Miller could embody extremes, moving from predator to protector with seamless credibility. Hollywood, always hungry for new archetypes, recognized a performer who could not only act but challenge the boundaries of what young actors were expected to be. That reputation led to more ambitious opportunities. Warner Brothers cast Miller in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, 2016, as Credence Barebone, a tortured youth caught between repression and explosive power. Once again, Miller tapped into the blend of fragility and volatility that had defined their early work. The role introduced them to global audiences, expanding their recognition far beyond the festival circuit. And then came the announcement that changed everything. Ezra Miller would play Barry Allen the Flash in the DC Extended Universe. Suddenly, the indie provocateur was part of a billion-dollar franchise, tasked with carrying a beloved superhero into the modern era. The casting confirmed their arrival at the top tier of Hollywood, no longer just a critic's favorite, but a studio's investment. This was the apex of the rise, the moment when Ezra Miller was both an artist and a commodity, celebrated for their originality while entrusted with the machinery of blockbuster filmmaking. But what looked like triumph also planted the seeds of future conflict. Because the same intensity that made Miller magnetic on screen would soon collide with the pressures of fame, scrutiny, and responsibility off it. By the mid-2010 second, Ezra Miller had positioned themselves as both a daring artist and a commercial asset. Their career reflected two lanes running side by side: prestige-driven roles in dramas and high-visibility parts in massive franchises. The combination was rare, and for a moment it seemed Miller had achieved what many young actors chase for decades: critical respect and mainstream recognition at the same time. The Fantastic Beasts franchise was a crucial stepping stone. As Credence Barebone, Miller once again tapped into themes of repression, alienation, and explosive inner turmoil. The character, a young man abused by his adoptive mother and hiding dangerous magical powers, became one of the emotional cores of the series. Audiences sympathized with Credence's pain while fearing the destructive force he carried. For Warner Brothers, it was confirmation that Miller could shoulder not only complexity but also franchise weight. The films grossed hundreds of millions worldwide, and Miller became a familiar face to audiences beyond indie cinephiles. Yet it was The Flash that marked the definitive peak. Announced as part of the DC Extended Universe lineup, Miller's casting as Barry Allen was bold. Traditionally seen as lighthearted and quippy, The Flash required an actor who could balance humor with emotional grounding. Miller's interpretation leaned into eccentricity, fast, talking, awkward, yet capable of moments of genuine vulnerability. Their first appearance came in Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, 2016, in a cameo, followed by a larger role in Justice League, 2017. For a generation of viewers, Miller became synonymous with the Scarlet Speedster. This role gave Miller something few indie actors ever receive: global visibility. Merchandise bore their image, Comic-Con panels featured their banter, and magazine profiles introduced them as the new face of DC's future. In 2020, Warner Brothers officially committed to a solo flash film, a project that had been in development limbo for years. The announcement signaled confidence not only in the character, but in Miller themselves as a bankable star. Parallel to these blockbuster commitments, Miller continued to choose projects that preserved their artistic credibility. They participated in experimental films and continued to be outspoken about LGBTQ+ identity and representation in Hollywood. In interviews, they cultivated an image of someone uninterested in fitting into traditional molds, whether of gender, sexuality, or stardom. This duality, mainstream superhero and avant-garde rebel, made them intriguing to both fans and critics. But with visibility came pressure. Being the public face of multiple Warner Brothers franchises placed Miller under a level of scrutiny they had not experienced before. Every red carpet appearance, every offhand remark, every unconventional outfit became a point of conversation. The qualities that once marked them as refreshing, a refusal to conform, a willingness to provoke, were now magnified through the lens of corporate expectations. Could the same unpredictability that made Miller fascinating also make them a liability? Still, at this point, Miller was at the height of their career. They had moved from festival darling to blockbuster lead, from fringe figure to pop culture icon. The trajectory was enviable, and the future seemed wide open. A solo flash film on the horizon, a continuing role in Fantastic Beasts, and the reputation of being one of Hollywood's most versatile young talents. Yet, just as quickly as the ascent had come, the foundation began to crack. The very intensity that fueled Miller's performances would soon spill into their personal life, with consequences no studio could ignore. The world was about to see what happens when the spotlight turns harsh and the narrative shifts from talent to turmoil. The momentum that had carried Ezra Miller from indie credibility to blockbuster fame began to collapse under the weight of headlines that no longer celebrated their talent, but cataloged their troubles. Between 2020 and 2022, Miller's name became synonymous not with new films, but with police reports and controversy. The rise that had once seemed unstoppable now looked precariously close to implosion. The turning point came in 2020, with the viral video from Iceland, in which Miller appeared to choke a fan outside a bar. The incident shocked audiences and raised questions about behavior that seemed at odds with the image of a young star on the brink of global superstardom. While no formal charges followed, the video lingered online, eroding public goodwill and planting seeds of doubt about their temperament. Then, in 2022, the controversies escalated dramatically. While in Hawaii, Miller was arrested twice in a matter of weeks, once for disorderly conduct at a karaoke bar, and again following an alleged altercation. Reports described erratic behavior, outbursts, arguments, confrontations with strangers. Local authorities painted a picture of a star spiraling, while tabloids eagerly amplified every detail. The narrative was no longer about Ezra Miller the actor, but Ezra Miller the headline. As the year progressed, further allegations emerged. Stories circulated about restraining orders, accusations of grooming, and claims that Miller had cultivated a cult-like presence around vulnerable young fans. Some details remained contested, others unverified. But the sheer volume of reports created a perception of chaos. For Warner Brothers, who had invested hundreds of millions in The Flash, the timing could not have been worse. Executives faced a dilemma: distance themselves from their star, or press forward with a film already in post-production. Public reaction was equally conflicted. For some, the scandals were unforgivable, confirming suspicions that Hollywood enables destructive behavior until it is too late. For others, they raised questions about mental health, accountability, and the pressure placed on young performers thrust into global fame. In statements released through representatives, Miller acknowledged struggling with complex mental health issues and announced they would seek treatment. It was a rare moment of candor, but one that arrived after immense damage to their reputation. Meanwhile, The Flash hung in the balance. Rumors swirled that Warner Brothers considered shelving the film entirely, despite its massive budget, to avoid the backlash of promoting a star engulfed in scandal. Ultimately, the studio chose to release it in 2023, framing Miller's treatment and public apologies as steps toward rehabilitation. The gamble underscored Hollywood's uncomfortable truth. When hundreds of millions are at stake, redemption can sometimes be less about morality and more about marketability. For Miller, this was the nadir of their career. The performer, once celebrated for versatility and daring, was now regarded as unpredictable and volatile. Red carpet appearances disappeared. Interviews dried up. Where once their eccentricity had been endearing, it was now framed as evidence of instability. The downfall was not defined by a single event, but by accumulation, one incident after another, each reinforcing a narrative of collapse. And yet, even at their lowest point, Miller remained a figure of fascination. Could this be the end of a promising career, or the messy, chaotic middle chapter of a story still being written? By the time The Flash reached theaters in 2023, Ezra Miller's name had become shorthand for Hollywood controversy. Yet the release itself symbolized something more complicated than either triumph or disgrace. The film was marketed cautiously, with Miller absent from major press tours, but its arrival on screen reminded audiences of the talent that had once propelled them to stardom. Critics who had long followed their career noted that, despite everything, the performance still carried energy, humor, and flashes of vulnerability, the very qualities that had defined Miller's appeal in the first place. But legacy is not written by a single project. For some viewers, the scandals permanently overshadow any artistry. For others, the story is unfinished. A question of whether genuine accountability and growth can open a path to redemption. Miller's statement about seeking treatment for mental health issues added another layer to the conversation, raising the possibility that the public might one day view this period not only as collapse, but as a turning point. Hollywood itself remains pragmatic. Studios have invested heavily in both Miller's image and the characters they portray. Whether those investments continue depends less on the controversies of the past than on the choices made in the present. If Miller manages to rebuild trust with colleagues, audiences, and themselves, the door to a comeback remains ajar. If not, their career may stand as a cautionary tale of how quickly promise can be consumed by chaos. In the broader cultural landscape, Ezra Miller's legacy is already complex. They are remembered for We Need to Talk About Kevin and The Perks of Being a Wallflower, performances that spoke to alienation and resilience. They are recognized as a rare openly queer actor to inhabit blockbuster franchises, breaking ground in representation even as personal struggles clouded that achievement. And they are the subject of debate. Can an artist's work be separated from their actions, or are the two forever entwined? For now, the verdict remains unwritten. Ezra Miller is still young, with decades of potential ahead, if they choose to harness it. The question is not whether they once had talent, the evidence of that is undeniable. The question is whether they can reclaim it, steady it, and convince a skeptical industry and audience to believe again. So what do you think? Will Ezra Miller's story be remembered as a cautionary fall, or as the foundation for one of Hollywood's most unlikely comebacks?